Okay. I'm going to use my cheater glasses so I can see this nice and clearly. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to what we did at the very beginning of the year, the very first thing I asked you to draw, the 1-point perspective room. And we're going to basically do the same thing, but we're going to use a little bit more of a controlled way of drawing it. So we'll just go through the simple steps of setting up a room. So the very first thing I want you to do is find the center of your sheet of paper. Now, you can either measure it, you can fold your paper over, find the center line, just basically like this. Just put a little crease here. It indicates the center. Then what I want you to do is I want you to go above it. Okay? Just a little bit above like that. And draw your horizon line right through. Now the reason I'm drawing my horizon line up here is because if you remember back when we were first talking about field of vision, what you see through your eyes, the idea that the horizon line is basically the separation line between the sky and the ground. What you may or may not notice when you're standing and speaking with someone is that normally you're looking directly into their eyes as they're talking. Sometimes if you're in a crowded room and there's a party going on and there's loud music and you can't hear the person talking, you'll stare at their lips and try and lip read them. But essentially, the angle of your head in relationship to that person is angled down slightly. And so what you tend to do is you tend to look at more ground than you do ceiling or sky. So under normal circumstances, whenever we're setting up a shot and we pretend that this sheet of paper is our field of vision overall, we tend to place the horizon line slightly higher. It's called the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds works in this direction here, where if you've got a character that's looking in this direction, usually you put that character roughly about here on screen. If you then cut to a shot of the opposing person who's talking to them, usually place them at about this point on the screen, which is 1/3 on either side. So we can use that 1/3 rule as far as our horizon line goes as well, by placing the horizon line just slightly above. What I then want you to do is pick a vanishing point, dead center. And then what I want you to do is from that point, take your ruler and find 2.5 inches. Two and a half inches and line it up so that it's right on the horizon line. Mark off where the 0 is and mark off where the 5 is. That's going to be our ceiling and our floor line on the far wall. Now just so that we make sure that our line is nice and parallel, put your ruler over to the side here a little bit, line it again up on the 2.5 inch mark. Mark off the 0 and the 5. And that will now allow you to connect those two lines across here. You're just going to extend a line across just a little bit like this. And do the same thing up top here. So then what I want you to do is, from your center vanishing point, again find the 2.5 inch mark. Mark off 0 here and 5 over here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to draw a parallel line, basically at a 90-degree angle here. Now there's a little bit of an optical illusion going on here with the camera. What you actually see on screen right now is a distorted image of what I actually have on my sheet of paper. So when I measure this off here 5 inches over to here, see what's happening on screen for you guys? It's not an actual square, it's more of a rectangle. However, when I post the video, when you see it on online, this will end up being a square. Okay, so just ignore, for the class, ignore the fact that it's a rectangle there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to extend this out.
Wait, sir, stop.
Pardon me?
I'm stuck.
You're stuck? All you're drawing is a 5-inch square box. 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches around your center point. And then once you've gotten to that point, I want you to go through your vanishing point, and you'll automatically go through each of the corners, the two opposing corners. See how my ruler lines up here? If I go through the vanishing point right here, it automatically connects this corner here and this corner here because it's equal distance on either side. So I'm just going to extend my line out on either side. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the opposing corners. From corner to corner, we'll automatically go through the center. So now what I have is I'm standing inside of a room. And my horizon line is halfway up the wall. So what I'm going to say is that the distance from this point here on the floor to this point here at the ceiling is 8 feet. It's an 8-foot ceiling. Therefore, half the distance right here is 4 feet. What I then want you to do is bisect this in half here, and bisect it in half here, and then do the same thing in the opposing side. Find half the distance. You can measure it if you want, or you can just eyeball it. Half the distance there and half the distance there. Then do the same thing across the bottom here. Find half the distance, and then quarter it. Half the distance up top, quarter. And now from those points that you've created, I want you to have extending lines coming from your vanishing point, radiating out along the wall and the ceiling and the floor. So from your vanishing point, you're just going to connect each of those halfway points and extend it out. Now technically, the same thing we did with each of the corners, you should be able to do the exact same thing with those points that you've created. If you rotate it across from the vanishing point, where you go through this one, should automatically connect through this one. So you'll know that if you're off a little bit, they won't match up. So just try and get them to be as close as possible. So now I have a series of planks that are extending out around the entire room. What I want to do next is I want to create a grid system. I want to create a series of tiles along the floor here that make it look like I've got squares. So what I need to do is I need to take my ruler, line it up against that back corner there, and then just drop it down and look and say to myself, do those look like squares in the perspective that they're at? Okay, so if I pull it down here, those are not squares, those are rectangles. They're too long. So I have to shift my line until I get to the point where I can look at it and say, yeah, it's a square. So these are not squares. They're just a little bit too small. So I want to pull it out and just visually decide whether or not this looks like it's a square. I'm just going to draw my line across. And I'm going to continue down on the next line, drop my ruler down, and I know that these are coming closer to me, so that the distance between here and here is going to be less than the distance from here to my next line. So I can't put my line right there, it gets smaller. So I've got to make sure that it comes down a little bit further. So what you could do is you could measure it if you wanted to. Use your millimeters here. So that's 1 centimeter actually. So the next one has to be greater than 1 centimeter, which would be right there. That's equal distance. So I want to make it just slightly bigger than that. I'm just going to drop the line down just a little bit. Maybe 1 millimeter lower. And then continue on to the next line. So each one is going to be progressively getting larger and larger as you come down. But you got to make sure that you're keeping them parallel. Don't start letting them drift like this. Otherwise your lines will start to skew as you come down. So what we're doing here is we're making judgment calls. We're looking at our line and we're deciding for ourselves, does this look right? So as soon as it stops looking right, you know you've gone in the wrong direction. That line there is not quite in the right space. I made it a little bit too close. You can see the distance between here and here looks like it's greater than what I've done here. So here's where the little voice in my head goes, excuse me, Brian, I think that line that you drew there is not quite in the right place, so, oh, what, you want me to shut up? Okay, fine. I'll just go on to the next line. Okay. And so I go on to the next line. But I've made an error there. So now everything that I draw from this point on is going to be wrong. So I have to go back and let that voice talk to me and say, you know what, that is a wrong line. You better make the correction right now. So I go in and I shift my line and make it there instead. Okay, then I come down to my next line. So if I get down to here, nope, too long. It's making the line too long. Shorten it up. Closer, right about there. Looks pretty good. Go to the next line. That looks pretty good. Maybe just a little bit shorter. A little bit. I can actually see my line on the bottom here is sort of skewing a little bit. So I can see somewhere along the line here, possibly my horizon line was not in the right spot. Let me just measure it from the top. It's 9.3. Yeah, it's off slightly at the top here. My horizon line here is actually skewed slightly in this direction. So when I do come down here, my line will not line up to the bottom of the page. It's going to be skewed slightly. So I have to just keep that in mind. And then the final line will go off the page. Okay, so there's my grid on the floor. Now, as I look at it, I can see that the distance between this line here and this line here, this one here is not quite in the right place. I didn't put it quite right. It should come down a little bit lower. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that mistake on there. I'm going to leave it, and you'll see what's going to end up happening later on. Okay? So that is a mistake which throws off this line as well. So any lines that I connect to those two lines are now going to be wrong from this point on. So now what I want to do is I want to go to my wall, my surface over here, because what you have to do is, again, as you're drawing, you're thinking about what this environment is. And you have to assign a name to it. So this is my floor. I put a tile on the floor. And when I'm walking along inside my room, I'm going bonk. Oh, I can't go any further because there's a wall there. Clunk, 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 wall. I can't go through it. Okay? So that's a surface now that's coming towards me in space. So I want to continue my grid by extending these lines up the wall here from the point that they touch down here, making sure that they go parallel. And I do the same thing as I did on the floor. I connect my dots and I create a grid along the side wall. So I do that for each one as I proceed up. Now, personally, I'm at a slight disadvantage here because I'm off to the side. You can see where my head is. I'm actually centered over this part here. If I was doing this correctly, my head would be here, so I can actually see the angle of it. That's why every so often you see me tilt my head like this. I'm looking at the screen over there to make sure that my lines are going right. So here at this point, this is where my lines are starting to go wrong on the floor, which is going to cause the wall to go weird as well. So you can see on this part of the line here, you can see the distance from here to here and here to here is practically the same. This line really should be over here, roughly in about that position right there, which would cause this line to actually connect at this point right here. So you can see how far off it's gone. But like I said, I'm going to stick with what I got. And you'll see that the end result will not be what I want it to be. So this line here should be way out as well. And I probably have another line extending up here. So now you can do the same thing for the wall over here, or you can continue up across the ceiling if you want to. So connect that point there. Oops, I'm in the wrong position for it. Cross like that. And now I got to make sure that this line here connects in at the right point. Those two lines have to connect together. This point down here and this point here have to connect. There's something wrong here. This has actually become skewed now. So those 2 points actually do not connect in the same point. Right up here. Those two are not connecting. But luckily it's up towards the edge of the field, so I really don't notice it as much. Oops. Okay, so there's my grid finished up there. And if I wanted to, I could complete a grid on the back wall as well. That. So there I've created a room that has a grid system on it that defines a space. And as you remember, I said that the walls were 8 feet high. So basically each of those lines represents a 2-foot space. It's a 2-foot square. So I can find any position anywhere within the room based on this grid system and create any type of an object within that room scaled to whatever size I want it to be scaled to and positioned anywhere I want it to be positioned within the room. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to draw a bookshelf sitting on the floor along this wall over here, 1.5 feet away from this corner here. So it's 1.5 feet away this direction. The bookshelf is 1 foot deep. So from this point here against the wall, it's 1 foot deep. It's 4 feet wide, and it's 5 feet tall. Okay? So the dimensions of the bookshelf are 1 foot deep. You might want to write this down. 1 foot deep, 4 feet wide, 5 feet tall. And it is positioned 1.5 feet away from this corner here, along this wall. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to draw that. I'm going to turn off the camera and I'll draw it myself so that when we come back, mine's all finished. And I'll give you a few minutes to draw.